January 17, 1944. Dobadura Airfield, New Guinea. The air hung thick with equatorial heat, shimmering above the pierced steel planking that made up the runway. Sweat dripped from the brow of Technical Sergeant Charles Lindbergh, not the famous aviator, but a 23-year-old farm boy from Nebraska who shared only a name with greatness. His hands, black with engine grease, worked methodically inside the cowling of a P-38 Lightning, that twin-boomed predator of the Pacific skies. Around him, the sounds of war preparation, the thunder of Wright Cyclone engines being tested, the metallic clanging of armor plate being riveted, the sharp bark of sergeants organizing sorties against Japanese positions in the islands beyond. But Lindbergh heard none of it. His attention focused entirely on a piece of ordinary steel wire, no thicker than a coat hanger, which he was threading through the turbocharger intercooler system in a configuration that violated every technical manual the Army Air Forces had ever published. The other mechanics called it stupid. His crew chief had laughed outright when Lindbergh first proposed it. Engineering officers from Wright Field would have court-martialed him for the suggestion. Yet here, 6,000 miles from Ohio and 20 feet from where Japanese bombers had cratered the runway 3 weeks prior, Lindbergh wrapped that wire around the intake manifold pressure relief valve and secured it with nothing more than electrical tape, and the certainty that men were dying because their airplanes could not do what the enemy's airplanes could do naturally. 72 hours earlier, 6 P-38s had engaged 15 Mitsubishi A-6M0s over Wewak. 4 Lightnings returned. The men who flew them told the same story they had been telling since Guadalcanal, since Port Moresby, since the bitter early months when America learned that the Pacific would not be won by courage alone. The Zeros turned inside them. Every time. At 15,000 feet, at 20,000 feet, at any altitude where the air grew thin and turbochargers became the difference between power and helplessness, the Japanese fighters carved circles in the sky while American pilots pushed their controls to the stops and watched their enemies slip behind them, watched the tracers walk toward their cockpits. Watched friends die because the airplane that was supposed to be superior in every measurable way could not turn with the fragile, lightweight machines that Japan had built from the philosophy that life was cheap and agility was everything. The P-38 Lightning was a contradiction wrapped in aluminum. On paper, it was magnificent. 2 Allison engines producing 1,425 horsepower each. 4 50-caliber machine guns and 1 20mm cannon concentrated in the nose. No need to harmonize gun convergence. Counter-rotating propellers that eliminate torque. A top speed of 414 miles per hour at 25,000 feet, faster than any fighter Japan possessed. Range enough to escort bombers deep into enemy territory and return. It was the airplane that America's industrial might had conjured from the drawing boards of Lockheed's Burbank facility, the embodiment of engineering excellence and manufacturing precision. Yet men died in it because it could not turn. The Zero, by contrast, was a machine born from different mathematics. It weighed 5,300 pounds empty. The P-38 weighed 12,800. The Zero's wing loading, the ratio of weight to wing area, was a mere 20 pounds per square foot. The Lightning's was 45. In the fundamental physics of aerial combat, these numbers meant that when 2 pilots pulled their controls back, when both tried to wrench their machines into the tightest possible circle, the Zero would complete its turn in 20 seconds while the P-38 took 32. 12 seconds. An eternity in combat. Long enough for a Japanese pilot to reverse his position from hunter to hunter, to align his guns, to press his trigger and watch another American fall into the jungle below. The Army Air Forces knew this. Intelligence reports from every theater where P-38s faced Zeros documented the turning radius disadvantage. Engineering studies explained it with graphs and formulae. Tactical directives instructed pilots to never, under any circumstances, attempt turning combat with Japanese fighters. Use your speed, the manuals said. Use your altitude. Dive on them, shoot, and extend away. Never turn. Never try to fight their fight. But war is not conducted in the clean geometry of tactical directives. Pilots got separated from their formations. They encountered enemies at low altitude where speed advantages disappeared. They found themselves alone with Zeros on their tails and only one option: turn as hard as the airplane would allow and pray it was enough. Usually it was not. Charles Lindbergh understood none of the aerodynamics. He had never read the engineering reports from Wright Field or the tactical assessments from 5th Air Force Headquarters. He knew only what the pilots told him, and what the pilots told him was that their airplanes would not turn, that the controls felt mushy above 20,000 feet, that the engines seemed to lose power just when they needed it most. He knew this because he listened, because unlike the engineering officers who visited from rear area commands, Lindbergh spent his evenings in the tents with the men who flew, and he heard the frustration in their voices when they described combat, and heard the grief when they counted empty cots. The solution came to him not through study but through accident. 3 weeks earlier, working on an engine that had swallowed a bird on takeoff, he had removed the intercooler ducting and noticed something the technical manuals never mentioned. The turbocharger wastegate actuator rod had nearly an inch of mechanical play in its mounting bracket. When manifold pressure built up, when the pilot pushed the throttle forward demanding maximum power, this play allowed the wastegate to flutter, to open fractionally and bleed off exhaust gas that should have been driving the turbocharger. It was a tiny loss, perhaps 3 inches of manifold pressure, perhaps 5% of total power. In level flight it meant nothing. But in a turn, when the pilot demanded maximum power to maintain altitude while pulling 4 or 5 times the force of gravity, when the airplane balanced on the edge of a stall, that 5% was the difference between maintaining the turn and wallowing out of it, losing airspeed, becoming an easy target. Lindbergh's solution was primitive: wire the wastegate actuator so it could not flutter. Hold it closed mechanically, force all the exhaust gas through the turbocharger, give the pilot every inch of manifold pressure the engine could produce. The engineering officers would have explained why this was dangerous, why it risked overboosting the engine, why it violated temperature limits and pressure tolerances. But the engineering officers were not at Dobadura. They were at Wright Field and Orlando and Maxwell, and their caution had been calibrated in peacetime, when the loss of an engine meant a report to file, not a man falling into the sea. On January 20, 1944, a test pilot took up the modified P-38. Lindbergh had chosen the wire carefully, testing different gauges and tensions, settling finally on steel wire scavenged from a demolished B-17's control cables. The pilot's name was Captain Robert DeHaven, an ace with 9 confirmed kills and a reputation for honest assessment. He climbed to 20,000 feet and put the Lightning into a maximum performance turn, pulling until the edges of his vision grayed, until the wings groaned under stress, until the airframe shook with the proximity of a stall. The turn took 28 seconds. 4 seconds faster than specifications. 4 seconds closer to Zero's 20. DeHaven landed and found Lindbergh. The mechanic expected criticism, and expected the pilot to report the dangerous modification. Instead, DeHaven asked a single question: "Can you do this to every airplane in the squadron?" Within a week, 18 P-38s at Dobadura had been modified. The wire trick, the pilots called it. Some called it Lindbergh's Band-Aid. The engineering officers, when they eventually learned of it, called it criminal negligence. But the pilots called it something else after the first combat test. They called it life. February 3, 1944. 8 P-38s engaged 12 Zeros over Alexishafen. The American formation, instead of diving through and extending away, turned into the Japanese fighters. The Zeros, expecting the usual tactics, committed to turning combat confident in their advantage. But the P-38 stayed with them. Not perfectly, the Zeros still held a slight edge in pure turning radius, but close enough that American pilots could employ other advantages. The P-38's concentrated nose armament meant that even a deflection shot, even firing while both airplanes turned, carried destructive potential. The Lightning's ruggedness meant it could absorb damage that would shred a Zero's unarmored airframe. Most critically, the psychological effect. Japanese pilots who had grown accustomed to American fighters fleeing from turning combat suddenly found themselves in sustained engagements, found that the twin-boomed machines could stay in the fight, could meet turn with turn, could make the Japanese pilots defend instead of attack. The engagement lasted 11 minutes. When it ended, 5 Zeros had been shot down. All 8 P-38s returned to base. One had bullet holes through the vertical stabilizer. Another had lost 18 inches of its port wingtip to cannon fire. But all returned, and the pilots who climbed from the cockpits spoke with an excitement that had been absent from squadron ready rooms since the early days of the war. They could fight now. Not run, not extend, not dive away. Fight. The Japanese noticed. Radio intercepts decoded by Allied intelligence in the weeks following the February engagement revealed confusion in Japanese tactical communications. Zero pilots reported that the American twin-engine fighters were performing differently, that established tactics no longer produced results. Some Japanese reports speculated that the Americans had introduced a new model, a version of the Lightning with more powerful engines or modified wings. They were partly right. The P-38s were performing differently. But the difference came not from Lockheed's factories or the Army's engineering bureaus. It came from a Nebraska farm boy with a piece of wire. The modification spread quietly through the 5th Air Force. Crew chiefs at Port Moresby heard about it from mechanics who had rotated back from Dobodura. Squadrons at Nadzab tried it on their own aircraft and saw the same results. By March 1944, an estimated 60% of P-38s in theater had received the wire modification, installed not through official channels but through the informal network of maintenance personnel who shared what worked and ignored what did not. The technical manuals continued to specify proper wastegate actuator tolerances. Engineering inspection teams continued to fail aircraft that showed signs of overboost damage. But in the forward areas, where combat occurred daily and losses had to be replaced with men barely out of flight training, the wire trick became standard. The official response, when it finally came, revealed the chasm between institutional engineering and battlefield necessity. In April 1944, a team from Wright Field's Aircraft Laboratory arrived in New Guinea to investigate reports of unauthorized modifications to P-38 turbocharger systems. They brought precision instruments and testing protocols. They brought technical orders and safety regulations. What they found appalled them. The wastegate actuators on dozens of aircraft had been mechanically locked in configurations that violated every safety margin built into the Allison engine's design. Manifold pressure readings exceeded redline limits. Cylinder head temperatures ran hot. The modifications, the Wright Field engineers concluded, would reduce engine life from the rated 1,000 hours to perhaps 600. They recommended immediate reversal of all modifications, court-martial proceedings against responsible maintenance personnel, and a directive forbidding any non-approved changes to turbocharger systems. The report went up the chain of command, from 5th Air Force Maintenance to 5th Air Force Command to Far East Air Forces Headquarters. At each level, officers who had flown combat, who had lost friends to Zeros, who understood that engine life meant nothing if pilots did not survive to bring the engines home, filed the report carefully and did nothing. The wire trick continued. Yet understanding why the modification worked required grasping what American pilots had expected versus what they experienced. The men who flew P-38s had joined the Army Air Corps believing in technological superiority. They had trained on airplanes that were faster, heavier, more powerful than anything the enemy possessed. They had been taught that American engineering represented the pinnacle of aviation science, that German and Japanese aircraft were inferior imitations produced by inferior industrial systems. The propaganda of 1941 and 1942 reinforced this. The Zero was made of bamboo and rice paper, propaganda claimed. It could not dive without falling apart. Its pilots were nearsighted and unimaginative. The truth arrived with brutal clarity at Guadalcanal, Port Moresby, and Darwin. The Zero was not made of bamboo. It was an exquisitely engineered machine that prioritized specific performance parameters, maneuverability, range, climb rate, over others such as armor protection and pilot survivability. Japanese pilots were not nearsighted or unimaginative. They were superb combat aviators, often with years of experience from China and extensive training in aerobatics and gunnery. And the P-38, for all its technological sophistication, could not defeat the Zero in the turning combat that characterized Pacific engagements. This created a psychological burden that American pilots carried into every mission. They flew aircraft that cost $120,000 to produce, that incorporated cutting-edge turbocharger technology and sophisticated control systems, yet they had to run from enemies' flying machines that cost $25,000 and used fixed-pitch propellers. The shame of it gnawed at squadron morale. Pilots developed a fatalistic attitude, accepting that combat with Zeros meant flying a tactical retreat, hoping to survive long enough to find an altitude advantage or friendly support. Some refused to engage Japanese fighters at all unless conditions were perfect. Others grew reckless, attempting turning combat despite the odds, and many did not return. What they experienced after the wire modification was not a transformation into superiority. The P-38 still did not turn as tightly as the Zero, but rather the restoration of parity. They could now contest the turn, could stay in the fight long enough to employ their advantages: better armament, better durability, better teamwork. The psychological effect was profound. Pilots who had avoided combat now sought it. Aggressive tactics replaced cautious retreat. Squadron kill ratios improved from roughly even to 3-1 in favor of the P-38s. The historical record documents this transformation through operational reports and pilot accounts. The 475th Fighter Group, known as Satan's Angels, operated P-38s in New Guinea from August 1943 onward. In the 4 months before the wire modification became widespread, October 1943 through January 1944, the group claimed 62 aerial victories while losing 34 aircraft, a ratio of 1.8-1. In the 4 months after, February through May 1944, they claimed 187 victories while losing 19 aircraft, a ratio of 9.8-1. Some of this improvement came from declining Japanese pilot quality, as veteran aviators were killed and replaced by less trained recruits. Some came from improved American tactics and better coordination with ground controllers. But the pilots themselves attributed much of the change to the airplane's improved turning performance, to the fact that they no longer had to flee from every Zero encounter. Charles Lindbergh never received official recognition for the modification. His name appears in no Army Air Forces citations, no engineering reports, no official histories. When Wright Field eventually redesigned the wastegate actuator system in late 1944, incorporating a modification that achieved similar results through approved engineering methods, the technical order made no mention of field modifications or unauthorized changes. The institutional memory of the Army Air Forces, concerned with maintaining discipline and proper procedure, could not acknowledge that a sergeant with no engineering training had solved a problem that had eluded their experts. Yet the pilots remembered. In squadron histories written after the war, in memoirs published decades later, veterans of the Pacific Theater mentioned the wire trick, often with the wry acknowledgement that it had been technically illegal and completely necessary. Some remembered Lindbergh's name. Most did not. But they remembered the moment when their airplanes began to perform as they needed them to, when the P-38 transformed from a machine they had to accommodate into a weapon they could wield. The symbolic weight of the wire itself deserves consideration. Wire, the most prosaic of materials, found in every culture, every technological level, representing connection and constraint in equal measure. Farmers used wire to fence their fields. Telegraphs used wire to span continents. In Lindbergh's hands, wire became the physical manifestation of improvisation over procedure, of pragmatic solution over bureaucratic approval. The wire connected nothing electrically, it was purely mechanical, a simple constraint that prevented unwanted movement. Yet metaphorically it connected ground crews to pilots, theory to practice, institutional failure to individual initiative. Throughout the Pacific War, American abundance expressed itself in grand terms: fleets of bombers, divisions of troops, tons of supplies flowing from the industrial might of a continental nation. But abundance also meant something more subtle: the freedom for individuals to experiment, to question, to implement solutions without waiting for official approval. Japanese forces, constrained by rigid hierarchies and strict adherence to doctrine, could not accommodate such improvisation. When a Japanese pilot reported problems with his aircraft, the response followed established channels: report to maintenance, refer to technical manual. If no solution exists, accept the limitation. The system did not permit a mechanic to modify the airplane based on pilot feedback and his own judgment. American military culture, for all its emphasis on rank and procedure, retained space for individual initiative, particularly at forward positions where oversight was loose and results mattered more than methods. The wire modification could not have occurred in a Japanese squadron or, likely, in a German one. It required a specific cultural context, one where a sergeant could listen to pilots, could work on their aircraft without explicit orders, could implement a solution that violated regulations but served the mission. This was not efficient in the industrial sense. It was democracy expressed through maintenance procedures, the principle that good ideas could come from anywhere, and that hierarchy existed to serve the mission rather than to be served. The Zero pilots who encountered modified P-38s in early 1944 could not have known about a piece of wire. They knew only that American tactics had changed, that the enemy fighters now stayed to fight instead of running, that the comfortable certainty of Japanese technological advantage in maneuverability had eroded. Some Japanese pilots adapted, developing new tactics that played to the Zero's remaining advantages: its superior climb rate at low altitude, its ability to sustain turn performance longer than the P-38, whose modification increased power but also increased fuel consumption in hard maneuvering. But adaptation could not restore what had been lost: the psychological dominance that came from knowing that in any turning engagement, the Zero held the advantage. By mid-1944, the balance of air power in the Pacific had shifted decisively toward America. New aircraft types arrived: the F-6F Hellcat, designed specifically to counter the Zero, and the P-47 Thunderbolt, rugged and powerful. Improved versions of the P-38, including the J model with revised intercoolers and better turbocharger systems, addressed many of the Lightning's shortcomings through proper engineering. The wire modification became obsolete, replaced by official solutions that achieved better results without violating safety margins. Yet the 6 months when Lindbergh's improvisation made the difference, January through June 1944, coincided with critical operations in New Guinea and the Marianas. During this period, American forces secured air superiority that enabled MacArthur's advance along the New Guinea coast and Nimitz's thrust through the Central Pacific. The P-38 squadrons provided top cover for amphibious landings, escorted bombers striking Japanese bases, and contested enemy attempts to reinforce their positions. The improved turning performance did not win the air war by itself. No single modification could do that, but it allowed P-38 pilots to fight effectively during months when numerical superiority had not yet become overwhelming, when the outcomes still hung in balance. The engineering officers from Wright Field were not wrong in their concerns. Several P-38s did suffer engine failures attributable to overboost conditions created by the wire modification. Cylinder heads cracked from excessive temperature. Turbocharger bearings failed prematurely. The modification reduced engine reliability measurably. But in the calculus of war, reduced engine reliability that kept pilots alive while they fought their way home was preferable to perfect reliability in aircraft that could not survive combat. The engineers measured failure in hours of operation and deviation from specifications. The pilots measured success in whether they saw sunrise the next morning. This tension between engineering perfection and battlefield adequacy played out across every theater of World War II. The Sherman tank was mechanically reliable but undergunned. The B-17 bomber was rugged but vulnerable. The Garand rifle was accurate but heavy. In each case, American forces fought with equipment that represented a compromise between ideal performance and industrial producibility, between what engineers desired and what factories could manufacture in the quantities required. The wire modification was unusual not because it improved performance at the cost of reliability. That trade-off occurred constantly. But because it emerged from the bottom up, from the field rather than from design bureaus, from necessity rather than from planning. After the war, when military historians compiled lessons learned, when engineering studies analyzed what had worked and what had failed, the wire modification received barely a footnote. Official histories credited P-38's success in the Pacific to improved tactics, better pilot training, and the introduction of the J model with its engineering refinements. These factors mattered. But they obscured the reality that for 6 crucial months, the performance improvement came not from Lockheed or Wright Field or Army Air Forces headquarters, but from a sergeant who listened to pilots and thought about how to help them. Charles Lindbergh rotated back to the United States in July 1944. He spent the remainder of the war at an aircraft overhaul depot in California, supervising engine rebuilds, training new mechanics, doing the work that kept the vast American aerial armada flying. He never flew in a P-38. He never saw combat. His contribution to the war effort would not merit a line in general histories. Yet 63 men who flew P-38s with wire-modified turbochargers survived combat engagements that they would otherwise have lost. This is not speculation. Squadron after action reports document instances where pilots in modified aircraft sustained turning combat with Zeros and emerged victorious, explicitly noting that they could not have done so in unmodified aircraft. 63 men returned to base, to their tents, to their letters home, who would have fallen into the jungle or the sea. Some died later in other engagements. Others survived the war, returned to America, married and raised families. Their children and grandchildren exist because a mechanic thought that regulations mattered less than results, because he trusted his judgment over the technical manuals, because he understood that perfect could not be the enemy of good enough. The broader truth that emerged from this episode illuminated something fundamental about American industrial and military power in World War II. The United States did not win the war through technological superiority alone. Often American equipment was merely adequate rather than excellent. Nor did it win through superior strategy or generalship. American commanders made countless mistakes, paid heavily for them, and ultimately prevailed through persistence rather than brilliance. What America brought to the war was adaptability at scale, the ability to produce vast quantities of adequate equipment, to modify and improve it based on battlefield experience, to empower individuals at every level to solve problems rather than wait for solutions to flow down from authority. The Zero represented Japan's pre-war philosophy of warfare: exquisite machines flown by elite warriors, unbeatable in single combat but impossible to replace when lost. Japan began the war with approximately 3,000 trained carrier pilots. By 1944, most were dead, and the training infrastructure could not produce replacements of equivalent quality fast enough. The Zero itself, designed in the late 1930s, received only minor modifications during the war because Japanese industry lacked the capacity to redesign it while maintaining production rates. The P-38, by contrast, embodied American abundance and adaptability. Lockheed produced more than 10,000 Lightnings during the war. The design evolved constantly, improved turbochargers, better cockpit heating, increased ammunition capacity, upgraded engines. When problems emerged, engineers redesigned components. When factories identified manufacturing improvements, they implemented them immediately. And when a sergeant in New Guinea found a solution that the experts had missed, it spread through informal channels because the system was loose enough, confident enough, to accept innovation from unexpected sources. This was not democracy in the political sense. The Army Air Forces remained a strict hierarchy, and sergeants did not vote on policy. But it was democracy in a deeper sense. The principle that truth and good ideas could emerge from anywhere, that rank did not confer omniscience, that the man closest to the problem often understood it better than distant experts. The wire modification succeeded not despite military hierarchy but because American military culture retained enough flexibility to permit it to look the other way when mechanics violated regulations that did not serve the mission. In the decades after the war, as the P-38's combat record was analyzed and memorialized, the wire modification faded from memory. Aviation historians focused on official modifications, on the engineering improvements that came from Lockheed and Wright Field. Veteran reunions celebrated aerial victories and remembered fallen friends, but rarely discussed the mechanical details that had made those victories possible. Charles Lindbergh himself, when contacted by a researcher in 1978, could barely remember the modification, though perhaps it had not been as important as the pilots claimed, suggesting that improved tactics probably mattered more. Perhaps he was right. Perhaps the wire trick was only a small factor in the vast equation of the Pacific Air War. But to the pilot who pulled into a hard turn at 20,000 feet above bivouac, who felt his P-38 stay with the zero instead of wallowing out of the turn, who aligned his gun sight and fired his concentrated nose armament into the enemy's engine, to that pilot in that moment, the wire trick was everything. It was the difference between hunter and hunted, between victory and defeat, between living and dying. The American advantage in World War II was never primarily technological. German jets flew faster than American propeller fighters. German tanks had better guns and armor than Sherman's. Japanese torpedoes were superior to American ones for most of the war. The advantage was systemic, an industrial base that could produce overwhelming quantities, a cultural flexibility that permitted innovation at every level, and a military structure that, despite its flaws and rigidity, retained enough space for initiative that a sergeant could improve the most sophisticated fighter airplane in the inventory with a piece of wire and electrical tape. This is the larger truth that the wire modification illuminates, that freedom, properly understood, is not merely political liberty or economic opportunity, but the space for human ingenuity to operate, to question, to improve. The wire represented improvisation in the face of institutional failure, individual initiative where bureaucracy had reached its limits, the principle that solving problems mattered more than following procedures. These qualities were not uniquely American. Every army had clever mechanics. Every air force had pilots who bent rules. But American military culture, shaped by a society that valued individualism even as it demanded conformity, created more space for such initiative than more rigid hierarchies allowed. The Zero pilots who died in combat with wire-modified P-38s were not inferior warriors. They were men fighting for their country with the tools their nation provided, constrained by a system that did not permit sergeants to modify aircraft or pilots to question tactics. The Americans who survived those combats were not superior humans. They were beneficiaries of a system that, for all its flaws, permitted more room for adaptation than its enemies' systems did. The difference was not in the men but in what the systems allowed the men to do. As the sun set over Dobudura on that January evening in 1944, Charles Lindbergh cleaned his tools and prepared for the next day's work. Around him, 18 P-38s sat on the pierced steel planking, each carrying in its engine compartment a piece of wire that represented the gap between theory and practice, between what was approved and what was necessary. In 3 days, some of those airplanes would engage the enemy. Some would take damage. All would return. And on subsequent evenings, intense across New Guinea, pilots would gather and tell stories about combat, about the moment when they turned with a zero instead of running from it, about the strange and wonderful fact that their airplane finally did what they needed it to do. No monuments commemorate the wire modification. No medals were struck. History remembers the P-38 Lightning for its distinctive twin-boom silhouette, for its service from North Africa to the Pacific, for shooting down Admiral Yamamoto and escorting bombers to Berlin. The wire trick remains a footnote in technical reports, a minor detail in the vast chronicle of World War II. Yet for the men who flew those modified aircraft, for the 63 who survived combat they should have lost, the wire was more than a mechanical expedient. It was proof that someone had listened, that someone had cared enough to solve their problem, that in the vast industrial machinery of American military power, there remained space for human judgment and individual initiative. The wire itself, once the war ended and the P-38s were scrapped or sold off, disappeared. Melted down for scrap, discarded in Pacific jungles, lost to rust and time. No museum preserves one. No archive catalogues its precise gauge or length. But the principle it represents endures, that abundance means not only quantity but also the freedom to adapt, that democracy expresses itself not only in ballot boxes but in the space for individuals to solve problems, that victory comes not from perfection but from the willingness to do what works regardless of what the manual says. In a piece of wire wrapped around a turbocharger actuator, improvised from scrap and installed without permission, lived the essence of why free societies, messy and inefficient and often wrong, nevertheless prevail against systems that value perfection over adaptation, procedure over results, authority over truth.